Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Mike and it has certainly been a while since I made a speaking appearance and used an actual camera. In this series of videos, I'll be going back to my roots as a failed tech YouTuber and taking an objective look back at various things in the world of tech and gaming from 10 years ago. In these videos, we're not going to look back at these things nostalgically or in the case of tech, attempt to use them today knowing very well that the experience is probably not the same as it was back then. Instead, we're going to take off our rose-colored glasses and see some of the tech and games that came out exactly a decade ago from the very day each of these videos were uploaded as everything they were and everything they weren't. So, without further ado, let's kick this new series off with a look back at a 10-year-old version of a very popular mobile operating system. Ten years ago today, on September 19, 2012, Apple released iOS 6 to the public. We can easily tell even at a glance that iOS 6 is a far cry from the latest version of the OS that was just released a week ago. While iOS has been all about built-in functionality and feature parity with the competition for a while now, saying that Apple was going in quite a different direction with iOS 6 is a bit of an understatement. Due to Apple's Toyota-like approach of trying to create the best possible product or service by arriving later with a refined version of the same thing, instead of taking risks to race against or beat the competition, there was always some degree of feature disparity between iOS and its biggest competitor, Android, with some critics calling iOS behind the curve because of this. However, while there is little feature disparity between iOS and Android today, with both operating systems able to accomplish the same basic tasks with no additional software modifications, this wasn't the case with iOS 6. With a few exceptions, most updates to iOS following its initial release with the original iPhone in 2007 were mainly focused on quality of life, security and stability, and bringing refinements to the fundamental experience, which, frankly, wasn't all that much. There were a few significant additions made to iOS with some updates like iOS 2, for example, which gave users an official means of installing additional software through the App Store, and iOS 5, which gave users new ways of getting information and performing tasks on their devices using Siri. However, these were only additions on top of the fundamental iOS experience and didn't really change it in any way. iOS 6 wasn't any different, bringing a whole slew of refinements and quality of life updates to the fundamental experience, adding some new features on top of it, and introducing another new service, Apple Maps in this case, that is built into the OS. Everything else was still mostly as it was in previous versions, going all the way back to the very beginning in 2007. The home screen was still a fixed grid that filled up with app icons and folders only, no widgets or anything else from left to right and top to bottom, and there was no way for users to remove app icons from their home screen without uninstalling the apps outright. The only way to organize them was to put them into folders or move them to different pages, but the home screen would still end up being a bit of a mess, whether it was multiple pages long, filled with app icons and folders, or both. This was never an issue on Android, because unless a vendor chose not to include an implementation of it in its own custom skin or launcher, the app drawer was always a feature of that OS from the very beginning. There is also still no way for users to quickly change certain settings in iOS 6, like adjusting the screen brightness or toggling various connections on and off. It was all still a process of locating the settings app, opening it up, and navigating through various submenus to find and change those settings. Pulling down the notification center in iOS 6 did give users quick access to certain things, as long as they were looking to check the weather, catch up with stock market activity, tweet something, or post a status update on Facebook. While the quick settings panel was only added to stock Android with version 4.2 a month after iOS 6 released, many OEMs like LG, remember when they made phones, and Samsung had already been including their own takes on such a feature for quite a while already. Now, some of the built-in apps and features that came with iOS 6 were also lacking a little compared to what Android had. FaceTime, for example, still only allowed users to make one-on-one video calls but Hangouts, which had been included with Android as part of Google Plus for about a year at the time, allowed users to have video conferences with up to 9 other participants. The built-in search function on iOS 6 only located content that was stored locally on the device, while the one on Android doubled as a Google search bar for results from the web. Whether it was having to open a browser or download another app, there were yet more extra steps for iOS 6 users to accomplish the same task that would have been a lot easier and quicker for Android users. Of course, customizability was still limited in iOS 6 to just being able to change the wallpaper and various alert sounds, but customizability was never really the point of iOS to begin with anyway. Compared to Android, which was always about being open for vendors and users to make it as they please, iOS was always about being more practical and sensible, even though the whole home screen organization situation and all these extra steps seem a little counterintuitive when it comes to practicality. While Apple would eventually address all these issues, some of them were only addressed very recently. This is likely why iOS 6 is revered and continues to have a cult following in the jailbreaking community, since modifying the OS was actually able to bring changes to fundamental user experience and increase the feature parity between iOS and Android, among other things. It's why iOS jailbreaking seemed to be a much bigger thing in the past than it is today, and why much of the current jailbreaking community seems to prefer messing with older versions of iOS 6 included, rather than new ones. Before I move on to what was good about iOS 6, let's talk about the UI, which is what people probably remember the most about it. While the basic UI of iOS today is still mostly identical to that from a decade ago, its design language is decidedly modern and more timeless with its simple yet elegant visual elements and artificial yet familiar sounds. Now a bit of background. Microsoft led the way in redefining how a mobile operating system's UI should look, feel, and sound with the release of Windows Phone 7 back in 2010. It featured a flat design with simple iconography for representation and boxes and outlines for distinction. While Android OEMs had free reign when it came to making Android look, feel, and sound how they wanted it to look, feel, and sound, Google decided to follow in Microsoft's footsteps for stock Android with Ice Cream Sandwich a year later, adopting a mostly flat visual design with a few remaining skeuomorphic visual elements like certain icons and textures. Windows Phone 7 and stock Ice Cream Sandwich would employ sounds that are artificial yet familiar, and these changes among the competition carried through to their next iterations that competed with iOS 6. On the other hand, iOS 6 still looked very much late 2000s with its skeuomorphic elements both audibly and visually. Although these lock-like sliders, wood grain fabric textures, and sounds recorded from actual objects may have helped in making iOS more familiar and user-friendly at first, they were beginning to show their age quite a bit after remaining largely unchanged after 5 years, with some critics not hesitating to point it out. While iOS 6 may have been a bit dated and Spartan compared to the competition, there were some good things about it. The fact that it was so Spartan and fundamentally unchanged from the original meant that it was a very light OS, which enabled it to run well on the devices that supported it. Although an iPhone 5 or iPad 4 user would have probably had the best iOS 6 experience, even those using the iPhone 3GS from 2009 were still able to have a decent experience running iOS 6. Of course, this was also due in part to all the refinements that were made to the OS over the course of what was then 5 years. iOS 6 also served as a bit of a preview of what was to come for Apple, iOS, and the devices that run it. Siri, which is originally an iPhone exclusive, became available on the iPod Touch and iPad for the first time, cementing itself as not just an addition to the iOS experience on the iPhone, but rather a more integral part of the whole iOS and later Apple experience. Passbook, which later evolved into Apple Wallet, paved the way for Apple Pay by allowing users to pay at certain merchants like Starbucks with loyalty cards that could be loaded with store credit, and the camera app gained a panorama feature on certain iPhones and iPod Touches, a response from Apple to the beginnings of a mobile photography boom with the advent of widespread smartphone and iPod Touch ownership and image-based social media. And Apple Maps, despite suffering from a rocky launch, was just an early step in Apple's journey down the services rabbit hole, and it was iOS 6 that brought Do Not Disturb to the table. iOS 6 was also notable for having introduced some new privacy controls surrounding advertising, which worked to differentiate Apple from other big tech firms as one that is more respectful of users' data and privacy. So that was pretty much it for iOS 6. While it may not have been too much, it would end up being the last version of iOS to build on top of the original concept from 07, and radical changes would end up happening the following year. Looking objectively back at iOS 6 today, we can really see not only how far we've come with iOS in the past 10 years, but also how much the whole iOS versus Android battle has changed. And that brings us to the end of this video. Feel free to leave a like or dislike, I don't really care, have a discussion down in the comments, and subscribe if you don't want to miss my next video coming out on Wednesday where I take an objective look back at the launch device for iOS 6. Until then, goodbye.